He's hiding like this.
Okay, great. Welcome, everyone. It's great to see you. This is one of those special times of the year with Hanukkah coming. And actually, according to Jewish tradition, before holidays, rabbis are supposed to review the laws or traditions of different holidays. So before we light Shabbat candles, I'm going to take just a couple minutes with you and review some of the basic laws and traditions of Hanukkah, which, as you know, begins a week from Sunday night. That's why we've coined the term Thanksgivika. And so Thanksgivika is Thanksgiving weekend that ends with Hanukkah, is Thanksgivika. So a happy Thanksgivika to everybody. And it's interesting, Hanukkah is one of we call it a later festival. It's really not directly based in the biblical story. It's not one of the pilgrimage festivals like Passover, Sukkot, and Shavuot. Not one of the high holidays, obviously. We consider it like a historic holiday, as we would also include Purim in that category. And Hanukkah, of course, goes back to the story of 165 before the Common Era, when the Syrian Greeks moved south into the ancient land of Israel, and their plan was to Hellenize the Jews living in Israel at that time. And of course, that led to a great conflict because the Syrian Greeks eventually started tightening their grip on the Jewish community living there at that time. And it's worth noting that as the Greeks tightened their grip to try to Hellenize the Jews were not in agreement about how to respond to this outside force. In fact, there were many Jews living in Israel at that time who welcomed the Hellenizers. And they thought, what a cool thing. I think wearing a toga is a great idea. And I think the gymnasia, the idea of secular learning is a great idea. And they were kind of taken with the sort of romanticism of Greek civilization, which I think all of us who are products of Western civilization understand the art and the romanticism of Greek civilization. And our ancestors were no different. They were kind of mesmerized with the love of the human body and this attraction to what the Greeks talked about as beauty. And so you had a lot of Jews living at that time who were like saying to the Hellenizers, bring it on, we're ready for this. And then you had, of course, and it turned out to be a majority of the Jewish community that were not welcoming of the Hellenizers, as at least in my heart, I'm glad they didn't. They really wanted to hold the line against this forced assimilation into Greek culture. And there eventually was almost the makings of a civil war between the Jews themselves. And in addition, there eventually was a war, a guerrilla war against the Syrian Greek military that eventually came into Jerusalem and took over the ancient temple and defiled it. And you know the story of Judah Maccabee and Maccabee's family who fights back against the Syrian Greeks. And it says that after recapturing the Beit HaMikdash, the temple in Jerusalem, they wanted to rededicate the temple back to Jewish worship because the Syrian Greeks had defiled it terribly, knocked down the Jewish altars, set up, statues of the Greek pantheon. And the Maccabees and company went back in, they cleaned it up, and they wanted to rededicate it. And the legend says that they decided to rededicate it with the lighting of the eternal light, the Ner Tamid, which is that eternal light is mentioned, of course, in the Bible. Moses was instructed to add it to the ancient tabernacle. We see that eternal light in every synagogue we visit. And so they decided they would rededicate the temple by lighting that light. And the legend, you know it, they found one little chalice of oil that had the seal of the high priest, the pure olive oil for burning the eternal light. And they placed the oil in the light. And the story says the chalice, which should have only burned for a day, kept the light going for 8 days, and thus the 8 days of Hanukkah. And the word Hanukkah means dedication, from the Maccabees' desire to rededicate the ancient temple to Jewish practice and Jewish worship. It was quickly, within the next 100 years, that the story of the Maccabees and their surviving the onslaught of the Syrian Greeks made its way into popular Jewish culture, and the descendants of the Maccabees, eventually helped prosper and create the second commonwealth of the Jewish people. And they remembered the Hanukkah story. And so the Jews were commanded every year to remember the Hanukkah story by kindling a Chanukiah, a 9-stemmed candelabra, different than the 7-stemmed menorah that was in the ancient temple. It was 9 stems, 8 stems for each of the days, and then a 9th stem for the shamash, which was used to light the others. But the commandment says that it was not enough to just light the lights. The lights had to be placed in a public place where they could be seen from the street. In fact, the Talmud goes into some detail saying how it should be placed on a stoop outside the front door of the house, so people passing by would be reminded of the great miracle of freedom against all odds. And so it's interesting, when we light the Chanukiah, it's important. You have to do it without it being a fire hazard, but you should put it in a window. It should be visible outside your dwelling. Is very, very important. The second thing that's interesting about the laws of Hanukkah say that there's a specific commandment to light the lights. And this is kind of a little Hanukkah trivia question. So how many lights have to be lit to fulfill the commandment to light the lights? And here's the answer. So if you take a box of Hanukkah candles, anybody know how many candles are in a box?
44.
44, exactly. But guess what? 44 are not used to fulfill the commandment to light the lights. Only 36. The 7 lights, the 8 lights of the shamash, the 8 shamash lights between 37 and 44 actually don't count in fulfilling the mitzvah. And it's to teach this midrashic lesson that the servant, the shamash, should not serve for reward. And so they kind of downplay the shamash by not giving those lights credit for fulfilling the commandments to light. Only the 36 lights, and that's the total number of lights from the 1st to the 8th night. So you have 1 light, then 2 lights, then 3 lights, then 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. Add all that up, it equals 36. And of course, 36, I consider it the great lucky number in Judaism because it's twice chai, it's 2 times 18. And so by fulfilling the lighting of those 36 lights, we fulfill this great mitzvah. And we learn the lesson of the humility of the shamash. So those are some of the laws related to Hanukkah. The last thing is that, you probably already know the answer, but on Friday night when Hanukkah occurs, and there always is a Shabbat on Friday night, during Hanukkah, which candles get lit first? The Hanukkah candles or the Shabbat candles?
Hanukkah.
And the Hanukkah candles get lit first because, in theory, once you light the Shabbat candles, you can't kindle fire anymore. And so we light the Hanukkah candles first, usually right before sundown on the Friday, and then we proceed with the lighting of the Shabbat candles. So there I fulfilled my rabbinic responsibility by sharing with you the basic mitzvot related to Hanukkah. We do eat oily foods. That's not part of the commandments related to Hanukkah. It's just a custom, of course, to remind us of the oil that burned. And I've always said, my last statement about Hanukkah is Hanukkah gave rise to the specialty of cardiology. And we can be very thankful that we as Jews help promote that discipline of cardiology, because we would spend 8 days a year sucking down oily food. So there we have it. There's our introduction to Hanukkah. Put us in a good spirit, I hope. And now Let's light the Shabbat candles. If you have your candles, we can light them together. As we look at these candles, we're reminded of the commandment to remember the Sabbath and to take the Sabbath as a time of remembrance of the good things of the past week and the people we love. And the other candle is a reminder of observance, to observe the Shabbat and to really do everything we can to cease the mundane things we do during the week and the work we do during the week so that we can be rested and refreshed. Shabbat va yinafash. To be rested means you can sleep in a little bit, take a nap, and then be refreshed and do a little, create some good space for your soul. So we join together. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam asher kitshanu b'mitzvotav v'tzivanu lahadlik ner shel Shabbat. And Shabbat Shalom, everybody.
Shabbat Shalom.
Shabbat Shalom. Now we have our Kiddush cup. So if you have your Kiddush cup, we'll say the short blessing for the wine. So we think of the light of Shabbat and the sweetness of Shabbat. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam borei pri hagav. L'chaim.
Big crowd tonight.
So I want to share with you tonight about a story in the Torah that for the most part, people throughout history have tried to avoid. And the Torah is filled with such stories. This week's Parsha, Vayishlach, is a continuation of the story of Jacob. And we have here in this week's Torah portion, and this is the part of the story that always gets the most attention, the second encounter Jacob has with God. The first encounter is when he's running away from his brother Esau and he goes to sleep in this barren, rocky space, and he dreams of the ladder extending from heaven to earth. And God gives Jacob an invitation to become a holy person. And Jacob's like, I think I'm not ready. This week's Torah portion is the second divine encounter that Jacob experiences. And it's when he's anticipating a reunion with his brother Esau, from whom he stole the birthright. And Jacob, of course, has lived his life very much as a fugitive. But we find in this story the beginning of what I call Jacob's transformation to becoming a human being. And in this story, two things happen that are significant. On the one hand, he knows he's going to meet his brother Esau, and Jacob, who's been a hardcore narcissist his entire life, for the first time decides to protect someone else. And he takes his family and he puts them across the river to be safe from what he expects to be a terrible onslaught by Esau and Esau's minion. And then, in fact, he goes to sleep. He places the family on one side of the river. He goes to sleep, and the second encounter takes place where Jacob, we're told, wrestles with an angel. And the angel twists Jacob's thigh in the sinew of his thigh. And Jacob says to the angel, I want you to bless me, bless me. And the angel said, I'm not going to bless you, but your name is now changed from Jacob to Israel. And that is the origin, in fact, of the word Israel in this story of this week's Torah portion. And it's why, from that point on in the Torah, we use the phrase the children of Israel, which literally is referring to the children of Jacob, or the descendants of Jacob, who then became known as Israel. Israel, loosely translated, as someone who strives with God. That's the story that is commented about in synagogues all over the world almost all the time, because the very end of the story is something people really don't want to talk about. And tonight I want to talk about it with you and challenge you about that story and maybe offer an interpretation you haven't heard. We find right after Jacob's encounter with the angel, one of the most disturbing tales in the entire Torah, and it's often described as the Rape of Dina. For those of you who don't know the story of what is called the Rape of Dina, the way it's described is she's abducted by a guy named Shechem and is apparently raped by him. But the Torah is very confusing because immediately after that part of the story, it turns out that Shechem is totally swept off his feet by this lovely woman. And so what happens is that Hamor, Shechem's father, goes to Jacob and asks if his son Shechem could marry Dinah. Now, again, there's some contradiction here because the beginning looks like a rape, but the end looks like love. And Hamor goes to Jacob and suggests that maybe the clans could join up together and share resources and coexist on the land. And that, yes, it would be an intermarriage, but it would be of mutual benefit. So Jacob responds that this could happen under one condition, and that is if and only if Hamor, Shechem, and all the men in their community would voluntarily circumcise themselves. And it turns out, amazingly, they all agree to this. They all agree to this circumcision condition. And then a few days after this is done, and the men of Shechem they're obviously convalescing from what they had been through. And it turns out that Shimon and Levi, Dinah's brothers, they go to retrieve their sister. And while they're doing that, they murder all the men of that tribe, ransack their settlement, take the women and children as hostages, and essentially decimate the community as an act of revenge for what they believe is the violation of their sister. And in the end, Jacob sort of rebukes his sons. It's a very meek rebuke because he was more concerned. Jacob's still not quite as well developed a human as we'd like. He was more concerned about this incident would impact his reputation. But as I say, it was Jacob being Jacob, narcissistic, as was usual for him. Now, I'll tell you, you read the story closely, it sounds like an episode of Special Victims Unit ready to be written, with sexual crime, intrigue, murder, mayhem, and what ultimately looks like madness. But the most astounding part of this entire story, from beginning to end, is that Dinah's voice is never heard in this story. In fact, she does not speak, not even once. And we're told nothing of Dinah's feelings, her perceptions, or her desires in the story. And so this most disturbing episode has always called out for explanation, which has always created a challenge for the commentators because it requires us to face up to the extraordinary cruelty of Shimon and Levi. And if the men are willing to, if these men of the other tribe were willing to become closer to God through circumcision, then why would God's people be able to justify their murder? And to tell you the truth, in the end of the story, the weak reprimand by Jacob, and I say it literally, adds the worst insult to all the injury that had already taken place. Now, commentators throughout history have dug into this story. And, it's called the Rape of Dina, but the Hebrew, in fact, never really uses the word rape. In fact, the line that is used to call it a rape says he took her, he lay with her, and he was humbled. And then after all of this takes place, the sentence goes on to suggest, quote, speaking of Shechem, he cleaved unto Dinah, and he loved the young woman and spoke from his heart to her. So we ask ourselves, what really happened here? And it's interesting, when Jacob talks about this encounter between Shechem and Dinah, he refers to it as a relationship of defilement. And it's worth noting that throughout the Torah and other places in the Torah, when the word defiled is used, it doesn't refer to forced sexual relations. It refers to illicit, not allowed sexual relations. And so we're left with the question, was it a forced encounter or an illicit one? The rabbis have tried to answer this question for millennia, because there is this contradiction between the story suggesting Shechem's force, but even more so the emphasis of his love for Dinah. And to me, that's the part of the story that shouldn't be ignored. Because I will now say something not intending to be blasphemous, but I feel like this is a kind of a biblical rendition of Romeo and Juliet. And that it doesn't, in this case, end with suicide, it ends with homicide. And I'll tell you why I back this up.
Can you repeat? We lost you for about 30 seconds. Can you repeat something?
Oh, yes.
Thank you.
That
you said you didn't mean to be blasphemous, but.
Oh, I'm glad that got cut out. Maybe you're not supposed to hear it. I don't know. That the story, to me, is kind of like Romeo and Juliet with a twist. That it's about an actual love affair between these two people that doesn't end in suicide, but ends in homicide. And I'll tell you why I think that. Throughout the Torah, there is incredible anxiety expressed by the Torah writers who could not tolerate in any way intermarriage between tribes. And there are at least one commentator that suggests that the original story was a story about a love affair between two young people, between tribes, that was looked upon as illicit. But instead of telling the story, that this romantic tale was changed to a story of condemnation against illicit marriage. And I think we can understand Dinah's silence, her speechlessness, as a reaction in the face of such prejudice, in the face of such violence, and that what her brothers did was interrupt the natural flow of human love, which the Torah writers could not tolerate if it took place between different groups and people who were considered enemies of the Israelites. Perhaps her silence is the only response that was permitted her at that time, given the misogynistic control of ancient Israelite society in which men ruled and women were silenced to maintain control. So she was not able to speak up about her feelings. Or maybe her silence is a way to force us to speak on her behalf, to recognize that there are many silent victims of aggression and submission all around the planet. and that victims of attempted control of the free flow of human emotion is one of the worst transgressions of all. So I would say, just like in music, the rests, the silence are just important as the notes. I'd like to suggest that Dinah's silence is exactly forcing us to hear what we don't want to hear. And that is this. No matter what the writers of this drama had in mind, whether it was changed or edited or not, and we'll never know, I think we can't help but respond with empathy for the victims and have disgust for the murderers. And so it raises an age-old question. Do you or do you not believe that intermarriage is a taboo, to be condemned at the expense of honest, true love? It's a question our community has argued and debated from time immemorial. So I want to tell you a true story. I had a mother in the congregation call me and say the following, and I actually wrote it down, so I want to make sure I got it exactly as I remembered it. She said, "Rabbi, I'm distraught. My daughter is marrying a goy. I feel like my life is over." First, I told her that, we Jews don't really say the word goy anymore. It's really an unkind term for non-Jews, and we really shouldn't say it. And the second thing is, I asked her, I said, "Is he a nice man?" She said, "Yes." "Does he treat your daughter well?" "Well, yes." "Does your daughter seem to be in love?" She said, "Well, yes." "Does he treat her with respect?" She said, "Well, yes." "Are they happy when they're together?" She said, "Yes." "Does the man treat you and your family in an appropriate, kind way?" And she said, "Well, yes." "Would you say, just as a human, he's a mensch?" And she said, "Yes, I guess I would." And she paused. "And if you asked your daughter, what would she say?" She'd say, "How wonderful he is." And then the mother said, "But I don't want to hear it. I don't want to hear it. I know she sounds more happy than she ever has been, but I just don't want to hear it." And then I paused, a long silence, and I waited for her to hear her own words. And then I said, "By the way, have they said anything about raising Jewish children?" And she said, "Yes, they're going to raise Jewish children." So I said to her, "Really? Love doesn't come around every day, does it?" She said, "No, you're right, Rabbi, it doesn't." I said, "And they're not giving up the Jewish future, right?" She said, "No, I guess I'll have Jewish grandchildren. But I've been taught my whole life, intermarriage is a shanda. It's a shanda." And I said, true love is never a shanda, I said to her, never. She said, "Would you even perform the marriage?" And I said, "Of course I will." And she started to cry. She said, "Rabbi, thank you. My worry is now turned to joy." So I want to tell you, as your rabbi, I accept intermarriage. I respect intermarriage. And I am intermarried. I am intermarried, which is a rarity for a rabbi. And I can tell you, in my earlier, I call myself a baby rabbi. When I was a baby rabbi, back in Greenwich, Connecticut in the 1980s, and I was a single eligible baby rabbi. I fell in love with a Catholic person, and I was nearly run out of town for that, and ended up giving up that relationship. And I chose religion over love. And I can tell you that when I met Loretta, I knew I would never, never make that mistake again. Because I feel, I would say as certain as I can feel about anything, that God would never condemn the beautiful, healthy love, devotion, friendship, and partnership that Loretta and I share. And I happen to believe that love is the highest form of spirituality. That in fact, it transcends the particularisms of religion, because religion is just a human language of faith, whereas love is the language of life itself. So I say no one should have to endure the rejection and horror of Dinah, which was perpetrated by her brothers and her father in a fit of nothing less than murderous xenophobia. Some might consider this drash as blasphemous as a rabbi could make. But I will tell you something important. After a lifetime of studying the Torah, I prefer to respect the Torah even when it tells horrific tales, because those very tales demand of us to respond with higher moral clarity. And let me say it again. I prefer to respect the Torah even when it tells horrific tales, because those very tales demand of us to respond with higher moral clarity. So I would say, to conclude, thanks for listening, the point is not to argue about the pros and cons of intermarriage. The more significant point of the story is about humanity itself. It is that we need to listen to the voices of our children, to the voices of every single human who is different from us. We have to pay special attention to those who are silenced by force or fear. And we have to open our hearts to the hearts of every oppressed human being. And like Dinah, give voice for them on their behalf. I think the story asks us to heed the fact that Dinah's silence speaks louder than any words that could ever be said. Shabbat Shalom.
Shabbat shalom.
So
Brilliant.
tell me what you think. You can disagree, you can argue. Let's tear it apart now. What can we learn?
I couldn't help but thinking it just has to do with the name.
Go ahead, Charles.
Rabbi, one thing I've always wondered about, the 12 sons of Jacob were able to take wives from captives or from other populations as they went from one place to another, you know, whatever they had to do, moving their flocks, etc. But Dinah, if Dinah was going to remain Jewish, somebody who believed in one God, where was she going to find a male husband other than her 12 brothers? There weren't any other Jews. That's a real problem. And I think this story, I don't think she had a lot of alternatives, if you know what I mean. There weren't any other Jews around. There weren't any other Israelites. It was just her 12 brothers.
I agree, and all the more so to believe this was really written originally as a love story, which at least I've been convinced over the years. And it's not in any way to downplay the reality of rape. You know, part of the reason people are afraid to talk about it, from what I've shared, is that somehow it can be misconstrued as if we're ignoring a rape that took place. And that is not what this interpretation is about at all. There's lots of examples of abuse of women in the Bible, and the subjugation of women throughout Jewish history. So this is not in any way to ignore the assertion of rape, but I'm making the case, as others have, that it was casted as a rape to justify taking a stand against intermarriage, but that it may not have been, and the Hebrew leaves that question quite open. Yes, she didn't have other choices, did she? She really didn't. And let me relate your question to contemporary times. You know, part of what's changed in American society, you know, we first came to this country. I mean, not only were we ghettoized in a number of different ways in the early 20th century, but we were prohibited from participating in all kinds of things in the outer society, you know, 100 years ago. And even until the 1960s, even to the early 70s, you know, Jews didn't have the same access into certain professions. We know about this. It's part of what gave rise to the Jewish Community Center movement, was to create Jewish alternatives in the Jewish community that mimicked things that existed out in the non-Jewish community. And along with that, we were not considered acceptable marriage partners in the non-Jewish community. And that's, you know, something we've experienced before. I mean, best example, for example, when I teach a course about Spinoza and the Dutch Jewish community. When the Jews left Spain and Portugal and the Iberian Peninsula in the 16th century, many ended up in Amsterdam. And in Amsterdam, Jews were given great liberty to live amongst themselves and live their own Jewish religion, but the spoken rule was, but don't try to marry us. And again, unacceptable partners. But in the 1960s and 70s, you know, a lot of the obstacles to Jewish participation in the open society in this country did start to fall away. And attitudes about parochial religion started to change. And we became acceptable marriage partners in the eyes of some, not all, but in the eyes of some. And all of a sudden, Jews had choices outside the Jewish community that they never had before. And I think that presented at the beginning, you know, just a huge challenge and a sense of real anxiety, that in fact, our expansion into the open society, which we worked so hard to get, had some perceived negative consequences. And intermarriage was one of them. When I think about your comment, you know, it kind of begs the question, is it beneficial for the Jewish community to create marriages with people from other communities? If you look at Jewish history, the answer is yes. There are many examples of intermarriages that saved the Jewish people from war, that were alliances built around, that were marriages built around political alliance. There are examples of intermarriages and conversions to Judaism that changed the face of Jewish life for the better. So while I want the Jewish people to be preserved, you know, my answer to that is we should increase our birth rate. And, you know, my answer to that is, you know, we are so focused on success and opportunity and performance that of many ethnic groups in the United States, we have children among the latest of any group in this country. And that has impacted our fertility, the rate of our fertility significantly. So again, the search for acceptance, the search of opportunity that comes as a result of assimilation, you know, there are benefits, but there also are, you know, it creates other challenges. And I think your question illustrates that, Charles. Any other comments?
Donna just wrote in, is there a law to not be intermarried?
Yes, there are mitzvot in the tradition against intermarriage, for sure. And I can tell you it wasn't until really in the 1970s and even in the Reform movement, still to this day, although the Reform movement will not tell a rabbi, you can't perform intermarriages, it still continues to give the message. It is highly discouraged. And we have while we, in Reform Judaism, which is the most progressive of all, really, in some ways, Reform Judaism takes the stand. We accept the intermarried, but we don't condone intermarriage.
Interesting.
It's interesting and it's complex. And I can tell you that as a rabbi personally, you know, I came to the decision to perform intermarriages long before I met Loretta. And that was when I had been in Greenwich, Connecticut long enough that children that I had taken through bar and bat mitzvah were now old enough to get married. And they were coming back to their rabbi and saying, please, will you perform our marriage? And I cried. I couldn't tolerate saying no. It just didn't feel right to me. So I changed my position. And by the way, if you're a rabbi that performs intermarriages, you know, you are looked down upon and scorned by the vast majority of the institutional Jewish world. But I think in the end, this is how I look at it. You live long enough, you earn the right to be true to yourself. And that's it. That's it. That's exactly where I come from.
Wow. Wow.
I mean, I'm 65 years old and I'm an old rabbi. What are you going to do? Defrock me? I mean, you know, you're trying
You're
to.
not old. You're just getting started.
Yeah,
Stuff.
really, right. I'm just getting started. You know, you reach a point where you strive for higher moral clarity. And I think that comes with life experience. And I think the Torah celebrates when we do that. Otherwise, God would not have given us a mind that's capable of it.
That's true. That's true. Yeah, no, that was great. Thank you for sharing that. Everybody is muted, but just unmute yourself when you want to speak
please,
up. Okay.
I'm interested in being challenged. And because I know there's another perspective.
You know, I want to get back to the name of the father. Wasn't it Hamor?
I'm sorry?
What was the name of Jacob's father? Was it Hamor?
Hamor.
You know, I mean, I can't help but thinking that there's probably some relevancy to the name in the story, isn't there? Or not at all? Because Hamor is a pretty derogatory term in Hebrew.
Well, that just reinforces the fact that, you know, look what they did. They went in and they murdered Hamor and all his sons after they're sitting there recovering from self-circumcision. I mean, that's pretty barbaric stuff. But the writers, the Torah writers, understand when they were living in a time of, you know, tribal, truly ancient Middle Eastern tribal competition. And the Israelites come along and they're worshiping this deity named Yahweh. And remember, you know, they believed that Yahweh was like heads above all the other deities for one primary reason. The other deities were tied to localities, whereas the God of Israel was mobile. The God of Israel went where the people went. And that, created this image of greater power, influence, and let's face it, the 5 books of Moses, we get into Exodus and Leviticus and Numbers. We read the story of Moses leading the Israelites across the desert and decimating a number of tribes that are in their way. I call this the raging adolescence of the early religion of our ancestors. And we've seen other religions just from the history of religion, when they come on and they begin as like a cultic practice, and then they develop a corporate identity, and then they strike out and they become domineering. And we've seen it with Christianity, we've seen it with Islam, certainly with the major religions. We've seen it in Eastern traditions as well, where there's this triumphalism that takes over with the early recognition of, spiritual power. And then I say, thankfully, the world pushes back. And then we see mature religion hopefully emerge. And we do see that. We have mature Judaism, and a Judaism that lives peacefully among other religious traditions. And we have people of all the major religions of the world who are not extremists, and they're not religious fanatics. They believe in a rational expression of their core religious beliefs. And there are plenty of those people still left in the world, in case you forgot. And sometimes it's easy to forget, because it's not the voices that we hear the most of.
So in your definition, are you saying nationals, or are you saying like Sephardism and Anastasia, or are you talking religion?
I'm just talking religion, that there are extremists in every religious civilization who believe that their purpose is to dominate other religious civilizations. And I happen to think that's very adolescent. It's just one way to describe it in terms of human development. We think of adolescent behavior, it's an attempt of striking out and proving independence and having control over others. And it's less conscience oriented. There's less self-reflection. It's more about flexing, learning the limits of my strength. And I think there is a parallel you can use in religious sociology to talk about how religious civilizations evolve very similarly. But even, as I say, they evolve. Some people evolve and some people don't. I may have told you this, listen, I'll give you what I think is an example of the difference between an evolved and unevolved religious idea. An unevolved religious idea is this, and I think I may have told this once before. So imagine there's a person who owns a house, and the person has like 30 children. And the person says, we have rules of this house. And the rules are very simple. If you want to live in this house, you must follow these rules, no exceptions. I hold up a yellow card in the morning, wake up, get dressed, wash up, go to school, go to work. And at the end of the day, I'll hold up a blue card, time to go to bed, wash up, clean up, go to sleep. That's it. Follow those 2 rules. But then all of a sudden, you have like 30% of the children raising their hand and saying, but what about us? We're colorblind. We're colorblind. And the owner of the house says, too bad, you're out. Okay? To me, that's a metaphor for primitive religion. Okay? Evolved religion, or an evolved idea of a deity, is a deity that's loving enough, expansive enough, big enough that when it learns of the colorblind children can say, not a problem. I have something else for you. And in a way, the story of Dinah is about the first unevolved example of religion. My way or the highway. In fact, not only my way or the highway,
Mhm.
my way or you're dead.
Yeah. That's interesting.
Isn't it
Hmm.
amazing? The Torah can provoke so much thought.
Yeah, it is.
It boggles the mind.
It's a quiet group tonight.
I hope I haven't offended anybody.
I don't think so.
No, not me.
No, hardly. I do have a question about Dinah. When we first see Dinah, the Torah describes her as going out among the women, which tells me that she was straying away from her home and the protection of her brothers, and which leads me to believe that you're right, that she was having an affair, and that, or that she wanted to be seen or something like that, because she was behaving in a manner that was not considered exactly proper.
Mhm.
After everything happens, we never hear about her again. Okay, so there's some white space in the story,
Oh, yeah.
which, did they do honor killings in those days? And I'm wondering if she could have been punished as well as the men in that other community. Because we never hear about her again.
That is correct. And I think that, I don't know if there were, this is the one example I think of almost at least portrayed as an honor killing. But I happen to think it's a dishonorable killing. She isn't heard from again. And it's really interesting, after the binding of Isaac, Sarah's not heard from again. And
She dies.
she dies, exactly. But even afterwards, there's not even a word. I mean, and her voice is not even included in the binding of Isaac. It's not like, Abraham checks in with her beforehand and says, hey, honey, I think I'm going to take our kid up to the top of the mountain and I'm going to burn him on an altar. Okay. So she doesn't even get a chance to react. And, the commentators say that, the end of the Akedah says, and, it says only Abraham went back to Beersheba and dwells in Beersheba. Isaac is sort of left out there. And the next sentence is Sarah dies.
Well, I
And
think
of course, one of the modern commentators says, yeah, because Abraham came back. There's one theory that says actually Abraham did sacrifice Isaac, and he comes back without Isaac. And when Sarah learns of it, she drops dead. From a heart attack.
And I heard that that Isaac was so traumatized that he went to Hagar and lived with Hagar and his brother.
Yep, that's one of the midrashim.
Yeah.
And of course,
And then Sarah was so despondent that she died of a broken heart.
exactly. So the silence of these two characters following a trauma is very interesting. And I think it's possible, again, remembering, although there is a theory that if you read the book of Jay, which is a very interesting book about a documentary theory about the J strand running through the Torah. One interpretation is that that writer may have been a woman. We don't know, But we operate with the assumption that the vast majority of the writers, the composers, the editors, the redactors of the Torah itself were men. They were the ones who, the rare, limited scribal class of people that were even given the privilege of literacy. And that, maybe the men, they silenced Dinah on purpose, because I think, as you suggested, I mean, not only were they, did they consider, shouldn't use this word anymore. It's like, there are words we used to be able to use, we shouldn't use anymore. But the
Please use
writers,
them.
I'm going to use the word deplorable. That's why I made the disclaimer.
Oh,
So, but the writers had to think of, of all those people as deplorable, but I think they probably also felt in a completely misogynistic way that, as a lot of misogynistic men act, and as we still see going on with injustice in courts and in how rape is dealt with in this country, that there's always this little bit about blaming the victim, and that the victim's silence or her being written out of the story from that point onward was a way of their making a comment about her,
punishing her.
punishing her,
Yeah.
not only making her silent, but writing her out of the drama. Because what are they supposed to do with her afterwards?
But she can't marry.
She can't marry. She's now a permanent burden to her father, in their mind. And she's like a source of shame. Because let's also not forget that in the Talmud, this has always bothered me so much. When you read in Ketubot, there's a discussion about rape. And in that discussion about rape, it says, if a woman is raped, like in the city, then there's culpability on the part of the man. But if a woman goes out in a field by herself and gets raped, too bad for her. And that's Talmudic. So that's already, 700-800 years after the time of the Torah itself, and probably extends, as I say, the Talmudic period is minus 500 to plus 500. And that's just how I look at it. The time of the origin of the scribal class during the exile, the first exile, all the way until like the 500s of the Common Era. And, blame the woman, blame the victim, blame the victim. And I think it's terrible. It's terrible. Of course, and we know it still goes on in society today. Women are raped, and the women are the ones that have to prove themselves. That's just wrong. Wrong. So thank you for your comment. It's really good. Well, it's 8 o'clock. Anyway, thank you for an enriching conversation, and
Thank you, Rabbi.
and
Thank
by-
you for sharing, your
Well-
knowledge with us.
it's a blessing for me to be able to share that. I should keep living long enough to do it. And Kenahora, thank you. Also, by the way, I haven't said this before, but I think it'd be good, if there are topics that you're all interested in for us to talk about, send me a note, please. Send me a note. And I'm happy. The best part of sharing and teaching is learning in order to learn together. So I'm grateful I still have that opportunity as a rabbi. So thank you for that.
Yeah,
So-
thank you.
Why don't we, I'm gonna say we should, people may need to say Kaddish tonight. So let me share the screen so we can do that. anyone is saying Kaddish, if you'd like to share the name of the person you're remembering, let me invite you to do that now.
Melanie Morris,
Dorothy Schreiber,
Henry and Rachel Wheeler,
Don and Linda Medina and the Don Jr.,
Lily Paul,
Shirley Wolf, Julian Wolf,
Jay Davis, Estelle, Stella Cole, Kennedy Temple,
So let us join together as we say the Kaddish. Remember, the Kaddish does not mention death, but when it uses the word Chaim, the word life, it's referring to the life to come. It's an affirmation of God's eternal presence throughout all of the universe as we join together. Yitgadal v'yitkadash Rabbi Yama Tivrach Hirutei V'yamlich Malchutei V'chayechon U'v'yomechon U'v'chayedechol Beit Yisrael Agola U'v'zman Kariv V'yamru Amen. Yehi Shmei Rabba Mevorach Le'olam Le'omei Omaya Yitbarach Yishtabach V'yitpa'ar V'yitramam V'yitnaseh V'yitadar V'yitaleh V'yithalal Shemei Dekudsha B'richu Le'la Min Kol Birchata V'shirata Tushbechata V'nechemata Da'amiran B'alma V'yimru Amen. Yehi Shlomo Rabba Min Shemaya V'chayim Aleinu V'al Kol Yisrael V'yimru Amen.
Amen.
Oseh Shalom B'mromav Hu Yaseh Shalom Aleinu V'al Kol Yisrael V'yimru Amen.
Amen.
Good Shabbos, everybody.
Good Shabbat.
Yes.
Good Shabbos.
Shabbat Shalom,
Everybody.
V'Todar Rabba.
Shabbat Shalom
Shabbat
Shabbat
Shalom.
Shalom.
and a happy Hanukkah.
Thank you.
Yes.
Shabbat Shalom.
Happy Thanksgiving too.
And happy Thanksgiving.
Nice Thanksgiving. Yeah.
Shabbat shalom.
Shabbat
Bye-bye.
Hanukkah.
Give it,
Shabbat
Everybody. Neat.
Shalom.